This is Optimal Finance Daily, episode 2006, 4 Ways to Fight Inflation by Sean Mullaney of FiTaxGuy.com. And I'm your host and personal finance enthusiast, Diana Merriam. Let's get right to it and continue optimizing your life. 4 Ways to Fight Inflation by Sean Mullaney of FiTaxGuy.com. Decisions you make today can subject you to more inflation tomorrow. Here are ways to increase or decrease your exposure to inflation tomorrow. Tax planning. As a practical matter, most Americans have the majority of their retirement savings in traditional pre-tax vehicles, such as the 401k. Having money in a traditional 401k is not a bad thing. However, the traditional 401k involves trade-offs. An upfront tax deduction is the primary benefit in exchange for future taxation where there's a withdrawal or Roth conversion. Having money inside traditional retirement accounts subjects future inflation to taxation. Some of the future growth in a traditional retirement account is likely to be attributable to inflation, and thus there will be a tax inflation. Further, there are no inflation adjustments when it comes to the taxation of traditional IRA and traditional 401k withdrawals. An antidote to this problem is the tax-free growth offered by Roth accounts and health savings accounts. Getting money into Roths and HSAs excuses future growth from taxation, including growth attributable to inflation. Roth 401k versus Roth IRA. Of course, inflation is only one consideration. Many will do some traditional retirement account contributions and some Roth retirement account contributions. The question then arises, which Roth account to use? My view is that for many, a Roth IRA contribution, whether a direct annual contribution or a backdoor Roth IRA, is better than a Roth 401k contribution. Many don't qualify to deduct a traditional IRA contribution, but can deduct a traditional 401k contribution. Considering that reality, why not combine a deductible traditional 401k contribution and a Roth IRA contribution? Long-term fixed rate debt. Often we discuss how inflation hurts Americans, and we should be concerned about the bad effects of inflation. However, there is a way to become a beneficiary of inflation, using long-term, low-interest fixed-rate debt to your advantage. That's right. Hold on to that low-rate 30-year mortgage like it's a life raft. Okay, that's a bit hyperbolic, but the overall point holds. Inflationary environments are great for debtors, particularly those debtors who have locked in a low interest rate for a long term. Here's an example. Sarah and Mike have a 30-year, $400,000 mortgage on their primary residence at a 2.9 fixed interest rate. By paying the required monthly payment and no more, they benefit from any future inflation. By paying off the mortgage later rather than sooner, they're using devalued future money to pay the mortgage rather than more valuable current day dollars. Sarah and Mike benefit from inflation. Are there reasons to pay off a mortgage early? Sure. But in an inflationary environment, paying off the mortgage early gives the bank more valuable dollars to satisfy the debt. To my mind, a fixed rate, long-term mortgage is a great hedge against inflation. That said, there are few perfect financial planning tactics. Most involve risk trade-offs. One risk Sarah and Mike assume by not paying down the mortgage early is the risk of deflation. To obtain this inflation hedge, they expose themselves to the risk of deflation. If the US dollar starts to deflate, that is, it appreciates in value, Sarah and Mike will find themselves paying more valuable dollars to the bank in the future. Travel rewards. Travel rewards can help fight inflation. One way is using sign-up bonuses and other accrued points to pay for hotel room nights or flights. Using points gets out of cash paying, and thus inflation of the dollar hurts a bit less. However, keep in mind that travel reward points are subject to their own inflation. The hotel chain or airline can devalue the redemption value of points at any time. Thus, if everything else is equal, those with significant travel rewards point balances might want to spend those points sooner rather than later for travel. A second consideration are the features of credit cards. Some travel-branded credit cards come with certificates for free nights or a companion pass for a companion to receive free or discounted flights. If fighting inflation is a key goal, favoring cards that offer free night certificates or companion passes can be a way to fight inflation. Spending that leads to more or less future spending. We're used to assessing the price tag. $28,000 for that brand new car. That's a great deal. Or that's a terrible deal. But the price tag is only one part of the financial picture. If you buy a black cup of coffee at Starbucks, it might cost you $2.65. Fortunately, that's it. The cup of coffee isn't likely to cause you to incur later costs. What about a $45,000 SUV? That purchase will cause later costs, many significant. For example, the cost to insure a $45,000 SUV might be significantly more than insuring a $22,000 sedan. What about gas? By purchasing a larger, less fuel-efficient car, you lock in more future spending and thus more exposure to future inflation. Think about buying a large home with a pool in the backyard. That square footage attracts property tax, heating and cooling costs, and inflation in both costs. The pool in the backyard requires constant upkeep, subjecting the homeowner to another source of inflation. To my mind, food is a big one in the fight against inflation. What you eat today could very well translate into medical costs tomorrow, exposing you to significant inflation. Spending on foods with vegetable oils and sugars today is likely to increase your future exposure to medical expense inflation. The lesson is this: you can use today's spending to reduce your exposure to future inflation. Conclusion. Is there a perfect answer to inflation? No. But with some intentional planning and spending today, Americans can reduce their exposure to the harmful effects of future inflation. You just listened to the post titled 4 Ways to Fight Inflation by Sean Mullaney of FiTaxGuy.com. Have you noticed that I've been reading a lot of articles about inflation these days? It's been top of mind for many of our contributors for good reason, and I really appreciated how Sean presented a slightly different perspective today. We talk so much on this show about optimizing expenses and income, which is certainly relevant for fighting inflation. But keeping more of the money you have through optimizing taxes can also be a huge win. Good tax planning considers lowering your lifetime tax burden. But the main challenge I've seen with this is that most of us don't have a clue what our future circumstances or tax bracket will be. This is why it's wise to have a combination of tax-advantaged accounts, so that when you're ultimately figuring out a drawdown strategy for your assets, you'll have options. I was recently at a Camp FI event where I saw a compelling presentation from Mark Troutman, who blogs at Mark's Money Mind and retired about 7 years ago. He talked about the strategy of building 3 relatively equal buckets of money. 1, pre-tax retirement savings like a 401k or traditional IRA. 2, post-tax retirement savings or Roth accounts. And 3, an after-tax brokerage. This creates the most amount of options for tax planning. I found it interesting because I've always favored tax-advantaged accounts over my after-tax brokerage. And for most people who will struggle to save enough for retirement, that's the right approach. But when you're saving very large percentages of your income and are taking the FIRE approach, you could create a scenario where you have so much money in pre-tax accounts that you unknowingly create tax bombs for yourself when you go to do Roth conversions. Note, this is highly dependent on your time horizon for conversions, but nevertheless, I found it good food for thought. And that should do it for today. Have a happy rest of your day, and I'll see you on the Thursday show tomorrow, where your optimal life awaits.